Let's look in greater detail at what's happening in each of these regions. So we'll start by looking at what's happening at the receptive segment of the neuron, the dendrites in the cell body. This is where we have those graded potentials. They're graded because they decay over time. The action potential, it does not decay over time. It's got the same strength and it continues the whole way down, and that's because of those voltage-gated channels. Up here in the receptive segment, these are neurotransmitter-gated receptors, and they'll only be open as long as the neurotransmitter is bound. And so they create what are called these graded potentials, and we have two types. The inhibitory postsynaptic potential, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential is postsynaptic because the potential is happening after the synapse. These are going to move you away from threshold. So the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials will be caused by the opening of neurotransmitter-gated potassium channels. So it would be due to potassium flowing out, or to the opening of our chloride ion gated channels, so our neurotransmitter chloride ion channels that will allow chloride ion to come into the cell. Both of those are going to move you away from threshold. So they're inhibitory. They're going to inhibit the formation of an action potential. And so as long as our neurotransmitter is bound to its receptor and you have these things moving out, then they will be causing the inhibitory potential. And it's graded because, let's say it's chloride ion coming in. Chloride ion comes in a little bit and comes in a little bit. It's only going to affect the area right here, and if this neuron stops firing, then that'll be pumped back out. So it's going to decay over time as you get further away from the where that signal is originating from. The other type of postsynaptic potential we can have is an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And excitatory postsynaptic potentials are going to move you towards threshold. And this will be due to sodium ion coming in through those cation channels. So sodium ion will come in, and as long as the neurotransmitter is bound, sodium ion will be able to come in. But then as soon as the neurotransmitter leaves, then your sodium potassium pump takes back over and you pump that stuff back out. So it decays over time. That's why they're graded. So those are at the receptive segment, we'll have inhibitory or excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and it's totally determined by the receptor that the neurotransmitter is binding. So we can have, this neuron's only making one neurotransmitter that is going to be released at the end and from its synaptic knobs, but it can respond to a bunch of neurotransmitters. And what the neurotransmitter does, stimulate or inhibit, is determined by what kind of channel it's opening. So if the neurotransmitter binds a cation channel, then sodium will come in. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. If the neurotransmitter binds a chloride ion channel, it's inhibitory because it'll open a chloride ion channel and the negative charge will come in. So how the cell responds is totally dependent on what the channel is doing, or what type of channel is being gated by the specific neurotransmitter. So we'll see when we get to the autonomic nervous system, you can have the same neurotransmitter that has different effects in different cells, and what determines that is the receptor type you have. Alright, so that's what happens at the receptive segment, in the dendrites and in the cell body. All of that's going to be added up here at the initial segment. So if we look at the next part, the initial segment is this axon hillock, and it's going to be summing up what's happening up here. So summation is adding up what's going on. And the first type that is demonstrated here is called spatial summation. Spatial summation results because of a bunch of different excitatory postsynaptic potentials coming in close in space to the axon hillock. So they're adding up basically because you've got so many from so many different regions that are adding up and allowing this influx of sodium, so that there's you've got so many excitatory postsynaptic potentials happening in such close space to this axon hillock that it's able to sum up and reach that -55 threshold. As soon as we hit that -55 threshold, you'll fire an action potential, and that will self-propagate. So in spatial summation, what you're seeing is that we've got this excitatory postsynaptic potential coming from this neuron, another one coming from this neuron, and then all these different neurons are bringing in these excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and they're summing up in space. And that's happening here at the initial segment. So the postsynaptic potentials are coming in on the receptive segment and being added at the initial segment. We have another type of summation called temporal summation, and temporal is referring to time. So you can also sum up if your action potentials, your excitatory postsynaptic potentials are coming close in time. So this is just one neuron that is stimulating this second neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, but it's stimulating it over and over and over again. So that sodium is just coming in and coming in and coming in, so that basically you have so much sodium influxing that it will be able to add up and you'll reach threshold at that initial segment so that your action potential will fire. This is kind of like when we were looking at wave summation leading to incomplete tetany, leading to tetany. That's what's happening here. You're just not giving this enough time for that sodium-potassium pump to pump that sodium back out. So all of that sodium is adding up until we reach threshold. And then we'll fire that action potential. So summation is occurring, it's summing up here at the initial segment because of what's happening at the receptive segment. So you can imagine that if instead these were all inhibitory, then they could also sum up in space, but it would be moving you away from threshold. Same thing, if we're being hit over and over and over again by an inhibitory neuron, then you could sum up in time, but it would be moving you away from threshold. So it's the job of the neuron to add up all of our excitatory and all of our inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, and if we reach threshold, then we will fire an action potential. Because if we reach threshold, then the voltage-gated channels in the axon hillock will open. Sodium has no choice but to rush in. Potassium has no choice but to rush out. And so the action potential will be conducted down the length of the neuron until we get to the transmissive segment. So it's an all or none event. As soon as those voltage-gated sodium channels open, they're going to open, sodium's going to rush in. It's going to depolarize then the next region, open up these voltage-gated channels. This guy's going to go into its inactivation state. The potassium channel is going to take over and repolarize. This depolarization is going to move like a wave of depolarization followed by repolarization, and it goes down the entire length of the axon. It goes only in one direction because of the inactivation state of that sodium channel. So these guys down here now these guys will be closed but resting. These guys back here will be closed but inactivated. And they're inactivated just because that's what happens when at that positive 30 millivolts, they snap shut and they enter the inactivation state. And we'll see what that causes in just a little bit.
So that's when you were saying, like, you can push,
but it's not going to open.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then so like the one that's closed but resting, when so then like it's kind of like the resting potential is kind of like gonna diffuse-ish, like it'll elevate slightly over there.
So as soon as this sodium's dumping in here, it's going to be felt right here, and that guy's going to open. And then the next guy will open, and then he'll enter the inactivation state. And so it's kind of like, it's like a slinky. If you shake it, the wave just goes all the way to the end. It's like this wave of up and down. That's depolarization followed by repolarization. That happens the whole way down the length of the axon.
So, but the latter ones will open as like the sodium diffuses down.
Right.
Oh.
So it's that's what's making it self-propagating. Is that once this voltage gate opens and lets this sodium in, then that's going to be bringing it up to the threshold for the next sodium gate to open.
And all this is happening within a second. Like,
Yeah, as quick as you can think. So Depolarization is the consecutive opening of our voltage-gated sodium channels, and so they're going to, as the depolarization is coming, they're going to open, so they're sitting at closed, down, further down, this is closed and resting, and then as our action potential is coming down, the depolarization is going to open this guy. As soon as it, positive 30 millivolts gets hit, it's going to snap shut and enter that inactivation state, but that positive 30 millivolts will be enough to reach that negative 55 millivolts further down. So that it's just like a domino effect, that you open, 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 open the whole way down. It has no choice because the sodium is diffusing into the cell. And it's followed by repolarization as our potassium then exits the cell to bring us back to our resting membrane potential. But there's a little more to the story. We actually hyperpolarize. So if we look at this on a graph that's showing us time and our millivoltage, you're sitting here at rest at negative 70 millivolts. You sum up your excitatory and inhibitory but postsynaptic potentials. As soon as you have enough excitatory that you hit that threshold, you have no choice but to open up those voltage-gated channels. They open up and sodium rushes into the cell, bringing the cell to positive 30. As soon as we hit that positive 30 millivolts, it's going to close the sodium channels and put them in their inactivation state. Then our potassium is going to take over now. It's going to be leaking out and it's going to bring us back. And what actually happens is that potassium, it hyperpolarizes the cell. The potassium channels stay open longer past this time that we hit this resting membrane potential. So they stay open until we get to about negative 80 millivolts. And that's going to hyperpolarize the cell, and what that does is cause a refractory period. So, and then the sodium-potassium pump will take back over and reestablish our resting membrane potential. So, if we look at what this causes as far as the ability to stimulate the cell, we're sitting here at rest, we reach our threshold, we depolarize, then we snap shut to that inactivation state. What happens when we snap shut is we enter what's called the absolute refractory period. And in the absolute refractory period, no amount of additional stimulation will cause those gates to open. So that's like I've shut the door, I've locked it, I've bolted up the 2x4s, you are not getting out. Sodium is not getting in. So as soon as we hit this positive 30 millivolts, you hit this absolute refractory period. And there's no amount of additional stimulation that will open that gate. Potassium now will be leaving through the voltage-gated potassium channels, so it's going to be exiting the cell to repolarize us. And the reason that when we hit this threshold again, those channels don't open is because they're in that inactivation state. We're in our absolute refractory period. So then we come back, as soon as we hit our resting membrane potential, now the sodium channels are going to enter the closed state. So we call this the relative refractory period. So they're just closed but resting. And this is a relative refractory period because in theory, you shouldn't be able to just open those guys up again. We're not even at rest, but you can. If you hit them really hard with a bunch of excitatory postsynaptic potentials, then you can open them again. But now it's going to take you a little longer because you've got this extra 10 millivolts to overcome. You don't just have to go from negative 70 to negative 55. You've got to go from negative 80 to negative 55. So it's harder to get another action potential to go, but you can. So it's a relative refractory period because in theory you should be refractory, but if you really want to hit it with a lot of extra stimulation, you can get it to go. It's just got to overcome that extra 10 millivolts because of that hyperpolarization. So the hyperpolarization is going to give us this relative refractory period, and then our sodium-potassium pump takes back over, our leak channels take back over, and return to rest. Any questions on that? So during the absolute refractory period, there's nothing you can do to open those voltage-gated sodium channels. They're in their inactivation state. But then once we come back and hit our rest, they'll just go back to their closed resting state. And it's just going to take a little more to get them open if we want them open. So that's what makes it a relative refractory period. And what this does is ensures that our action potential goes in just one direction, so that it goes away from the soma. It's keeping it moving away from the soma. All right, any questions over that?
So the threshold for the potassium pumps, are they also just still negative?
It's still negative 55, but they're slow.
So then that's why they only start at number 3, like to have that.
That's when it takes over, yeah, because the sodium stopped rushing in really fast. So it's exactly like we talked about before. These voltage-gated sodium channels are fast. The voltage-gated potassium channels are slow. And you can see that. The depolarization is really quick and steep. Repolarization is not, it's not so steep a curve. It's happening slower. Any other questions? All right, so then once this action potential is coming down the axon, it'll get to those telodendria and get to the synaptic knobs. When we get to the synaptic knobs, it's the depolarizing swing that opens the voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium's higher outside the cell, so you open these voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium enters the synaptic knobs, fuses with our vesicles of stored neurotransmitter. The vesicles confuse with the plasma membrane and dump neurotransmitter by exocytosis. So this is showing us the synapse we're used to, the neuromuscular junction, but this could be another neuron, and in that case we would just call it a synapse. And then the parts of the synapse are the synaptic knob, the synaptic cleft, and the dendrite of the next neuron, in the case of neuron-to-neuron synapses. So the events in the receptive segment are that we can get these inhibitory or excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Excitatory postsynaptic potentials are going to be in the positive direction, and they're going to get us closer to threshold. Inhibitory postsynaptic potentials as a movement in the negative direction, they're going to move us away from threshold. So that's what's going to happen in the dendrites and in the cell body. And again, whether a neurotransmitter is excitatory or inhibitory depends on the receptor. Whatever receptor you're opening up is going to determine. If you're opening up a cation channel and sodium comes in, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter at that synapse. If you're opening up a chloride ion channel and chloride ion comes in, or you open up a potassium channel, potassium goes out, it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. All of these events are going to be summed up at the initial segment, either in space, because we have many of these excitatory postsynaptic potentials hitting very close together and very close to the axon hillock, or in time, when we've got just an excitatory postsynaptic potential being stimulated over and over and over again from the sending cell, and that will allow this net influx of sodium. Either way, as soon as we hit that threshold at the axon hillock, you will begin an action potential that will conduct down the length of the axon, because it's self-propagating. So if you sum up to threshold and reach threshold, you open those voltage-gated channels, sodium dumps into the cell. That's going to then depolarize the cell, close those gates and put them in their inactivation state, and then potassium will rush back out of the cell, repolarizing it. The depolarization followed by repolarization is the action potential. So the action potential is conducted down the length of the neuron. If we look at the neuron, you can measure the action potential at each of these nodes of Ranvier. So it jumps like node to node to node to node to node. That speeds up the conduction of the nerve transmission. And then once we get to the telodendria, this action potential is going to come all down the axon through the telodendria until it gets to the transmissive segment, where we'll open those voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium rushes in, allows the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane, and neurotransmitter dumps out. So then what we've done is we've taken this chemical message, converted to an electrical message. The electrical message is conducted throughout the axon and gets converted back to a chemical message.
So for the inhibitory postsynaptic potential, because it moves you away from the threshold, so then would it take you longer to make an action potential if you wanted to right after that, or would the pumps fix it first?
It depends on how it's adding up. You can have a bunch of stuff going on at this soma. So the axon hillock's just summing it all up. So if you've got a lot of inhibitory postsynaptic potential and just one little bit of excitatory, then it's going to move you away from threshold. Is it going to bring you back further down than rest? Is that what you mean?
Well, no, because it brings you away from the threshold, right? So then would it be at, because if the calcium one were to go in, would it take you to maybe negative 80 millimolar?
Chloride ion, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, in theory it could, if the only thing happening was that you were being repeatedly stimulated in an inhibitory fashion. Sure, you could sum up in the other direction.
So then wait.
But they're graded, so it'll decay over time. So that's the difference between what's happening here and what's happening down here. The action potential is the same magnitude the whole way down. These potentials aren't. They're graded. They decay over time.
So then are the inhibitory ones and the excitatory ones like happening simultaneously?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.